Well, good day, Western Standard viewers. Thank you very much for joining us. We are talking today to an Alberta woman, Sheila Annette Lewis, who has a terminal illness that she has been trying to get treated for more than 2 years. And she is joined also by her lawyer, Miss Allison Pejovic, who is working on behalf of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I'd like to welcome Allison to the studio.
Thank you.
And online, Ms. Lewis. Ms. Lewis, if I can take the liberty of explaining your situation for you, for our viewers, as reducing it to very simplest terms, you have a terminal illness which requires an organ transplant, but you cannot receive the organ transplant in Alberta because you have not received a vaccine against COVID-19. And the medical establishment is firm on this point. You have tested it twice in court, and now it may even go to the Supreme Court of Canada. I believe that has yet to be decided, but that's a possibility. But today, the news is that you have one more approach to the Alberta Health Services. Now, we're going to talk about all that, and of course what the implications of your new request would be if it were granted. But first, how are you?
Hello, Nigel. Thank you for having me on the show today.
You're very welcome.
I'm holding on, of course. I mean, my illness has definitely advanced. I'm now wearing 2 hoses, as you can see, instead of the normal one. So it's much harder to breathe now on a daily basis. Struggles are much worse. I'm very limited to what I can do inside my home. And
Are you in fact confined to your house?
yes, I am.
You can't go out?
No, I haven't been. I have not been out of my home for pretty well a year or more. It's been a long time. Well, yeah, it's over a year, a little over a year.
That's hard to bear.
Yeah. The 4 walls kind of come in sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've had, like, the obvious question here, I think most people who perhaps have not been following the case would say, well, Ms. Lewis, the answer would seem to be simple. Have the vaccination, let them do the operation. Why won't you do that?
Because I can't take the vaccine. Because if I take the vaccine, it's going to do a lot more harm, and I probably would never make it to the table anyway.
Now, is that is that advice that you've received from your medical practitioners?
Yes, from the medical field, from different scientists, doctors. I was also told that it's the mRNA spike protein that's inside the vaccine that will travel within 2 hours after I take, we'll call it a vaccine. I guess that's what they call it.
For conversational shorthand, let's call it a vaccine, yes.
Okay, so if I take the vaccine within 2 hours, it's going to travel into and go to my organs, and it's going to release millions and millions and millions of nanoparticles that are going to go into my cells and damage a lot of my cells.
Now, you must have explained this to the doctors who you've been consulting with in the Alberta Health Services. What do they say to that argument?
They said the vaccines are safe and effective. 100%. And I asked them on a scale. I asked them 2 years ago on a scale of 1 to 10, how safe are these vaccines? And he looked at me. He didn't even blink.
3 years? Did we have the vaccines in April 2020? I think they didn't come till 2021, did they?
21. Okay, 2 years.
2 years.
So,
okay.
So when I asked them, when they told me first that I would have to get a vaccine in order to stay on the transplant list, on the donor list, I asked them in the office at that time, I was going to visit him in his office. And when he said that to me, he looked straight at me, and I asked him how safe the vaccines were. And he looked right at me, didn't blink or nothing. He just said 100% safe.
So he was that confident that early in the vaccination process. That's an interesting comment.
When they first.
So the other thing that I think people might say to you, I think you already answered it, but I'm going to ask you again. Some people would say, look, you can't get the operation because you won't take the vaccine, so the outcome is inevitable. If you take the vaccine and have the operation, you might have some chance of extending your life. How do you answer them when they tell you that?
If I took the vaccine, I'm ending my life.
Okay.
Because it's going to do a lot of harm.
All right. Well, then let me switch over to you, Allison. I think most people don't question the basic default medical point of view that if you, the client, want us, the doctors, to help you, you need to listen to our advice. Now, for example, they will say something like, we're not going to give you a liver transplant unless you stop drinking. And there's a certain intuitive logic to that. Organs are scarce, and the medical profession would naturally want to give it to the people who they thought would benefit most from receiving them. So, in your view, how does Ms. Lewis's case fall outside that reasoning?
That's a good question, Nigel. We don't disagree with that reasoning. When you're talking about asking someone who is waiting for a liver transplant not to drink, that makes sense, and that's scientifically proven that alcohol damages someone's liver. So that makes sense. Similarly, if someone is waiting for a lung transplant and won't stop smoking, it makes sense that the doctors would say, well, this person is not a good candidate because they're going to keep doing something that's going to damage the new lung or whatever the organ is that that person is waiting for. You have to make sure that you're following directions that are scientifically proven not to harm that organ. Similarly, if somebody is morbidly obese, I could see a doctor saying, you're not the best candidate. Could we see if you could lose some weight first, because we want to give you the best chances of survival after your surgery. Those things, we would say you can't argue against them. What makes it different with these vaccinations as opposed to the vaccinations that someone gets when they're a child, those vaccinations have 30 years or more of scientific data on their safety and efficacy. These vaccines are brand new and they're novel. Also, they're still in clinical trials, which most people don't realize. They have been in clinical trials since the beginning of the vaccine rollout. And so this requirement that came in place for Ms. Lewis and all the other transplant candidates in Alberta was put in place, requiring them to take a vaccine that is still being tested for its safety and efficacy. And that came out in our case before the courts. And so why are they requiring a new medical product that is still in the testing phase? So they don't know what it could do to her or any other patients either before or after their surgery. That is unknown. And so what makes this case even more important today is that I'm sure Ms. Lewis will talk to you. She's just discovered that she has natural immunity to COVID-19. So certainly her case is even stronger than it was before at this point. There is no medical reason now why they should be denying her this transplant.
I see. Just to clear something up, Ms. Lewis, you're not against vaccinations in general, are you?
I'm definitely not against vaccines.
That's good. Just wanted to establish that point. Now, you've taken this, directing this question to Allison, you've taken this case to the Queen's Bench, as it then was, in Alberta, and they didn't agree with your position. They took it to the Court of Appeals. They didn't agree with your position. Can you explain, I know it's very complex stuff, but can you explain briefly what the issue is? What is it they won't accept?
Sure. We brought our claim as a claim under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada and the Alberta Bill of Rights. And of course, when you are making a claim under the Charter and the Bill of Rights, the party that you're making the claim against has to be either government or a government actor. So Ms. Lewis sued the transplant doctors, the Alberta Health Services, and the hospital where she was receiving treatment. And the courts, both levels of court, found that the Charter of Rights and the Alberta Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the doctors. Our argument was, and we had cited Supreme Court of Canada case law, was that these doctors are carrying out a government function. They're acting as government actors because they're implementing a provincial transplant program, which is run by Alberta Health Services. And so the courts found that no, this is a clinical decision that the doctors have made. This COVID-19 vaccine policy is a clinical decision. Our other argument, which was also rejected, was that, well, Alberta Health Services also has a vaccine policy, and that came out in the evidence. One of her doctors told her that by November of 2021, AHS now was requiring all transplant candidates to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. So in our estimation, this was a government policy, and the courts found that the government was copying the doctor's decision and therefore was immune to scrutiny under the Charter and the Alberta Bill of Rights, which we say was an error. And that is the reason why we have filed an application to have this case heard by the Supreme Court of Canada.
Do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, the Supreme Court of Canada receives about 700 applications a year and takes approximately, I believe it's around 60 to 70 cases a year. So, we've said that we've made a strong argument that this is of national importance because this doesn't just affect Ms. Lewis, this affects the relationship between doctors working within government programs and whether they are immune from charter scrutiny. And we think that is a very important issue that will transcend across the country.
Well, I think there's another very important issue here. Ms. Lewis, tell us about your experience with COVID and how you developed a natural immunity.
I didn't even know I had COVID, to be honest with you. I know in 2021, it was like September, I believe it was, August, September. I got really bad chills, and I mean really bad chills. And I filled a tub up full of hot water, sat in it for a while, lay down. 2 days it was gone. And then the very next week, it was the same thing, the next weekend. Exactly the same thing happened. I got the chills again really bad. Within 2 days, it was gone. And after that, I was fine. I wasn't any other way. Pardon me?
Were you tested for COVID?
No, I asked the transplant doctors 2 or 3 times to test me for natural immunity, and they said no, they didn't do that anymore. Then the last time I asked them again, I said, can you please test me for natural immunity? He said, no, we don't do that anymore, and we're not going to test you, but he said, I can look into it for you. I said, okay. So then I never heard back from him.
Medical team that's looking after you, is it, that you're asking to test?
Yes, the transplant team, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, my doctors, yeah.
So they wouldn't conduct that test.
No, I even asked them just to send in a requisition to the lab, Dynalife lab where I live, and they can come to the house because they come to the house and do blood work anyway, and just send them in a requisition so they could do it.
Did they tell you why they wouldn't perform that test?
He just said they don't do it anymore.
Well, that was that. Now, I think you went and got your own test done.
Yes, I did. I did it on my own. I was contacted. Somebody put me in contact with the doctor that does it in British Columbia. And yeah, he contacted me back. We ended up talking. He sent me out the test kits so I can get tested. I tested myself and then sent the kits back for him to analyze them. And then when the test results in 3 weeks come back, the results were great. I had extreme high levels of antibodies
Okay.
for natural immunity.
Turning back to you, Ms. Pejovic, what do they do in the rest of the continent? Is it the same everywhere?
I don't have specifics on what hospitals in the US, as an example, don't require COVID-19 vaccines to perform transplants, but I do know that it is not required across the country. So different hospitals in different states have different policies.
So what I think there's a body called the American Transplant Association. Are they a group that we should listen to? And if we should, then what do they say?
I can't recall if it's American Transplant Society or Association, but in any event, it came out in the evidence in our application that they recommend the COVID-19 vaccinations before transplantation, but they don't require it. They don't use language as though it's mandatory. So certainly there are differences, between hospitals.
So just because one medical administration does it this way, it doesn't necessarily mean that every medical administration would do it that way, and therefore, well.
Therefore, I mean, there's the science doesn't appear to be followed the same, but it depends on the doctors. It depends on the team. Unfortunately, in Canada, for Ms. Lewis, I think the other group that does transplantation for her would be in Toronto, but to my knowledge, they also require the COVID-19 vaccination. So in terms of getting a transplant in Canada, she's really stuck because of this requirement.
I see. Okay. So how does this move forward?
Well, I mean, we've sent a demand letter to her doctor's council and council for Alberta Health Services and the hospital, really outlining what the report found and kind of going through some of the evidence that came out in the cross-examinations a year ago when we did them. And what's interesting is that AHS's own expert in immunology actually admitted in cross-examination that it's reasonable for her doctors to test her for natural immunity. They hadn't at that time, and we didn't know at that time that she was naturally immune. And the doctor's medical ethics expert, she also said it would be reasonable for them to test her for natural immunity. We had two top immunologists as experts in our case. So when I make comments about natural immunity and the vaccines, I'm not speaking as someone who's professing to have any experience myself in immunology, but we have detailed, lengthy 70 footnoted peer-reviewed studies in one of the expert reports that we had. We've got top quality expertise here in immunology, and both of our experts testified and wrote in their reports that natural immunity is equal to or stronger than the immunity from the vaccines. And they also expressed serious concerns about the safety from the vaccines. Now, as I said, natural immunity at that time was not an issue for Ms. Lewis, but that evidence is there. The doctors and AHS are aware of that. And the CDC itself in August of 2022 finally admitted that infection-acquired immunity and vaccine immunity have resulted in drastic reductions in mortality and hospitalizations due to COVID-19. So that's been out there since last August. And even still, this transplant team is not testing its candidates to see if they're naturally immune. They've known that since last August, because as professionals looking at the CDC, this is not fringe anymore. Natural immunity has been recognized in and the scientific community at large as being very strong and equal to the immunity from a vaccine. Now, as the report said, natural immunity can wane, but so does the immunity from the vaccines. And I know that very well from another case that I argued as a case before the Federal Court of Canada, the travel vaccine mandate case. We cross-examined one of Canada's experts on the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines over time. And after 6 months, that effectiveness drops to about 20%. So any of these transplant candidates who were vaccinated more than 6 months ago, going by those numbers, how immune are they before they get their transplant if those vaccinations have been far in the past? So the issue of natural immunity, we say that has to be part of the conversation now. Mm-hmm. If these doctors and NHS are going to be following the science, otherwise you're going to see people like Ms. Lewis passing away needlessly going forward when they are ignoring the scientific proof that natural immunity is strong and durable and ought to be considered as an alternative to COVID-19 vaccination.
Turning, Ms. Lewis, I'm sure you have had advice about the booster that they recommended, actually demanded as the last hurdle for admission to the procedure for you. Do you have the same reservations about the booster as you had about the original vaccine?
No, the booster, I wouldn't recommend the booster to anybody. I really wouldn't, but that's just me. I don't trust the vaccines. Like Allison said, they're still in clinical trials. They're still being tested for safety and effectiveness, and how they can demand us to take a booster or a vaccine is beyond comprehensible. It's like where do they stop at this? Like this for the safety part for people.
Well, that's an interesting rhetorical point. I just wanted to be sure that you would not, whether you would even consider, after all this time and with what's at stake, whether you would consider taking the booster just to move this along and.
I didn't take it before. I damn well ain't gonna take it now. Not with all the information out. Okay. And as far as I made a lot of calls, I have a lot of time in my hands, of course. I made a lot of calls. I wanted to see why Canada has such harsh protocol when it comes to these vaccines. So I made a lot of calls to the United States, to lots of hospitals.
Why is Canada the way it is on this?
They have, in the United States, one of the firms that I contacted has emailed me and spoke to me and said they don't understand what laws and what they're going by in Canada. But they said in the United States, every state is different. Every hospital state is different, whether they want the vaccine or not. There's 60% of the hospitals in the United States that do not require a vaccine to get transplanted for an organ. And I've called different hospitals, yes, and I've had very good responses to the answers that I've asked towards the vaccine. The ones that I've...
60% number came from, Ms. Lewis?
Pardon me?
I said, do you recall where that 60, who provided that 60% number?
Yes, I do.
Yep. Who was it?
It was a firm in the United States. It was Liberty Counsel.
Okay. I think we might want to follow up on that with you. Allison, I think I'd like to end with some speculation on what this really means for everybody else. Clearly, we know what it means for Ms. Lewis. It's obvious. But if natural immunity is recognized as superseding the need for vaccination in case of COVID, surely would that not have wide implications for a lot of people, as after all that's happened in the last 2 years?
Absolutely, it would have implications for other transplant candidates. For starters, we would say, due to the results from this blood test, which was very detailed, and it told a lot of information. It told, when she was infected, as specific as she was infected and had recovered from COVID in September of 2021. Imagine the possibilities for other people who, for whatever reason, whether they have objections to taking a drug that's still in testing phase, whether they have an allergy to something in the drug, to be able to get tested for natural immunity, that could open the doors for a lot of people. We're the first to say that we don't believe there should be any vaccine mandate whatsoever. But if there is going to be a requirement for vaccination for anything, then natural immunity has to be part of that discussion and has to be an alternative, because the science is there to back it up. And so that would transcend into the employment sphere, people who've been let go from their jobs because they refuse to be vaccinated. Are they naturally immune? We should incorporate blood testing. We should have that further developed and available for people in this country and around the world to see how immune are you? And vaccinated people should be tested for immunity to compare the immunity between the antibodies in the blood from people who are vaccinated and people who aren't and who have recovered from COVID. So, those are conversations that have to be had in our view, for people's rights to be respected here. And so, we're really looking to these doctors and AHS to come to the table here and say, it's time that we accept natural immunity as an alternative. Someone like Ms. Lewis and other transplant candidates, if they can demonstrate that, then yes, they're good candidates for a transplant. So, what's the reason? Why are they not accepting her? It's unbelievable, and it's jaw-dropping. And we're at a loss for words as to why they are continuing to refuse her this transplant.
Well, I certainly don't. It puzzles me. But thinking about the rest of the world, people who were let go from their jobs because they didn't have the vaccination, wouldn't have the vaccination. Is there the possibility they could turn around and sue for unjust dismissal, dismissal without cause, due damages? Is this something going forward that we would have to?
Well, I'm not an employment lawyer, but certainly if there was natural immunity that was being ignored, I could see the door opening for lawsuits to come in. That would have to be looked at by Employment Council. But my point is that, from the expert opinion on both sides, from our case, I can safely and confidently say, and the CDC's, admission, acknowledgement of natural immunity reducing hospitalization and death, this levels the playing field now, and there is no excuse for this for employers, physicians to be ignoring natural immunity and not to have that conversation and not to explore what it means and have experts look into the results of these blood tests and perform their own blood tests. Why are we continuing to ignore this? And this is going to result for some people in loss of their jobs, but in someone like Ms. Lewis's case, it's her life is going to end. And it could end over this failure to accept natural immunity, which is scientifically proven now.
Yes. This to me seems like a tremendously important case. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it? Obviously, it's a 10 for Ms. Lewis.
When you're talking about somebody's life here, it's a 10 out of 10.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Pejovic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. I really appreciate you coming on the show today, your candor and your honesty and your willingness to share your intimate details of your life. You're a brave woman, and I just wish you all the best going forward.
Thank you. Can I just add one thing here,
Yes, of course you can.
please? This fight that I've been in for, against the transplant to see if they'll reinstate me for the last couple of years, or at least the last year for sure. Even though they stopped testing me 2 years ago, they're supposed to test me once every year for my organs. They're supposed to test my organs, make sure my heart is okay, in case when I was on the transplant donor list, in case I got an organ that came in for me. My heart would have to be okay. My other organs would have to be okay, like in good working order. They haven't tested me now for like 2 years now, and I needed to know that, but they won't do the test. They won't do no tests.
And what do you conclude from the fact that they won't continue to test you?
To me, they just gave up.
I see.
They just don't do any testing. But the thing is, there's people out there. It's not just about me. There's a lot of people that have been refused a transplant because for whatever reason they chose not to get this vaccine. Like, I speak to them. There's a young gentleman. He's like a lot younger than me he has a heart condition, and he was refused his transplant. I speak to him all the time. There's a young lady in Nova Scotia. She's devastated. She has a child. She has family. She has the same illness that I have. And she was refused a transplant because she didn't take the vaccines for whatever reasons she couldn't. And she's devastated. There's people around the country that's devastated, and they're dying. Like, they're dying. These doctors are letting people die because of something that they really haven't even tested properly. It's still in the clinical trials. And we are sentenced to death at a young age because
I think we're all agreed here in this discussion that this is indeed a 10 when it comes to the importance.
Like, there's so many people, and it hurts me. It just devastates me to know there's people out there suffering. They're suffering because somebody chose to write a policy and say, you are going to die if you don't take this vaccine. And that's the end of the sentence. A dot is there. But there's so many people in this country and around the world that are dying, and I can't do anything to help them. All I can do is try to fight this. But they won't budge. People need help. People need to live. They have families and children, and they have their life ahead of them. There's some younger than me. They have their whole life ahead of them. Like, my God, what's it going to take for them to turn this around? Like,
Well,
what is wrong with our Prime Minister?
people like yourself, Ms. Lewis, who won't give up, and the efforts of dedicated legal professionals such as Ms. Pejovic, who are working with you. I see no other way. So I want to congratulate you on your fight.
I'm going to fight it.
Again.
I'll fight, and I'll keep fighting for the people.
And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Ms. Pejovic. And for the Western Standard, I am Nigel Hannaford. Good day.
You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access. Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.